Welcome to Section 1, Key Concepts of Service Request Management. In the exam, there will be 5 questions of the 20, which will be understanding type of questions. From an exam perspective, in this section, we need to understand the key concepts of the practice, namely the purpose of the practice, and then some key terms and concepts such as the service request and their main characteristics, service request model, request catalog, and a few other concepts. And also the practice success factors, there are a couple, and the key metrics for the practice. We begin with the purpose of the practice. Note this statement carefully. In fact, for the exam preparation, you need to note the various statements carefully and closely because the exam has a mix of both understanding and application type of questions. So the understanding questions will be more theoretical and the application questions will be certain scenarios or simple situation where you need to apply your understanding and provide your answer. So the purpose of the service request management practice is to support the agreed quality of a service by handling all predefined user-initiated service requests in an effective and user-friendly manner, which means it is very user-focused practice. Any requests that are initiated by the user or the representative need to be handled in an effective and user-friendly manner. And these requests would be predefined, meaning they would be discussed, negotiated, and agreed as to what the requests can be and what their timelines would be for the fulfillment, and the agreed quality of the service as defined in the service level agreements and the service requirements would have to be met. So this is a key practice to keep the positive perception with the customer and the users in particular, and therefore it provides several benefits for the service provider as well as the service consumer. On the provider side, these are the benefits. Clear and structured patterns and methods of working because the service request would have been discussed and agreed and negotiated for their expectations for timelines and quality. It would be beneficial to the provider. There is also reduced costs associated with the request handling and fulfillment because the procedures would be defined and tested before the service requests go live for the users. There is also realistic fulfillment expectations and higher resulting levels of user satisfaction. And that's because there is a good discussion, negotiation, and agreement between the customer and the provider on the requests that are allowed and their expectations. And that's the one of the benefits there. And a very similar one, fulfillment of the service level agreements with service consumers. And all this leads to better reputation of the provider with the consumer due to the higher service quality and clear user expectations that are understood and also met. For the consumer, it's a bit similar, but worded in a different way. And the benefits are as follows: convenient methods of service request submission. It is important that the consumer is able to submit their request in an easy, convenient manner. And that is what is promoted by this practice. Then predictable and timely handling and fulfillment of the service requests. Then minimized impact to business operations because users can raise their request in a timely manner whenever they need it, and they should be fulfilled as per the predefined expectations. And therefore, on the consumer side, their employees would be happier that their work is going on smoothly because of the request being fulfilled effectively and efficiently by the service provider. Now, what is a service request? It is a request from a user or a user's authorized representative that initiates a service action, which has been agreed as a normal part of service delivery. There are a few key phrases here. One, it can be raised by the user or their authorized representative. Sometimes it can be one user liaison who might be representing around 50 users or more or less, and therefore we call it as a user's authorized representative. And the second thing here is that it's a normal part of service delivery, not an abnormal, for example, a degradation of a service such as an incident, but everything is working normally. It's just a request. Therefore, these make up an important type of a user query and an important part of the user experience, as I also mentioned earlier. Therefore, there can be lots of examples of requests. It could be an example of asking for information, which is a very simple one. Or it can be sometimes a standard change. For example, a request to replace an aging system with identical configuration. Normally, this would be The request would be initiated automatically, but fulfilled manually or in some cases automatically as well. Another request could be to create a standard environment for a new joiner employee. It can also be a standard firewall change to block an IP address as per security policy if that is allowed. To create a DNS entry could be another service request. To do a normal data load, and so on. And sometimes you could have multi-employee onboarding request, which is a bit more complex and not a simple request because there would be a lot more teams involved to fulfill that request. And also in another complex request could be procuring components as requested by someone if those are not fully available in stock because they would have to be ordered from a vendor and have to be followed up and so on. Therefore, all these can be categorized into different types, and we see that here. Typically, they may be a request initiating a service action performed by a service provider or jointly with the user. It can be a request for information. It may be a request for access to a resource, service or service offering. It could be feedback, compliments, or complaints. So let's take a look at some examples of these just to get some clarity. There can be some overlap between these examples, but nevertheless, uh, I'm taking you to some additional material. This is outside the main courseware that we were going through right now. This additional material is also available to you in your e-learning access. It's just a few slides with some examples that I'll be showing you from time to time. And I will also mention if it's from the additional supporting material PDF. So these are some examples. A service delivery action request could be to provide a manual or a report, to perform some installations of a software or a server. Request for information, the second one could be someone asking for office hours. Why not? Or maintenance window timings, or how to pull a report. So these are like queries. And the third one is provisioning a resource or service. For example, asking for a software or a laptop or a system. So you can see there is some overlap between the service delivery action and provision of a resource. And access to resource is like file access, login access. Provide positive feedback or raise a complaint. So that's very interesting that even providing feedback or raising a complaint can come through a service request from a user. And that's because though it could be coming in as a feedback, a positive one or a negative one, somebody would have to take an action, most likely. Particularly negative feedback will require some action on the service provider side, somebody from their side. And positive feedback may have to be passed on to a specific individual or a team. So these are some examples of service request. And let's move on. We are now going to look at some general service request guidelines, and we are back to the main courseware. So fulfilling such request may require changes to services or their components, usually standard changes. I did mention that example earlier, replacing an old server with an identical configuration. It's a standard change because we're making a change to the environment, but it doesn't need a meeting or discussion or a review to approve it because it's pre-approved. It's a low risk change. So those are generally part of the service request. Of course, there's a connection between request management and change enablement practice because standard requests are from the change enablement practice. So the activity of predefining those standard changes and testing them and approving them, there'll be an element of the change enablement practice coming into the picture there. Next, service requests are predefined and pre-agreed as a normal part of service delivery and should be formalized with clear standard procedures for initiation, approval, fulfillment, and management. This is a good thing because there should be a discussion between the customer and the representatives and the provider team in order to understand the request needs and the expectations on the timeline and the quality of the service. And afterwards, the provider will have to define the procedures on how to process those requests, how to fulfill them to the user satisfaction. Then only go live with those service requests for the users. Then request workflow may be simple or complex. And these steps, be it simple or complex, should be predefined by the service provider. These steps need not be known to the users, but the user should know at least how the request should be raised and what will they be kept informed about. For example, the progress of the request and so on. And these need to be tested by the provider so that the provider can agree times for fulfillment and provide clear communication of the status to the requests of the request to the users. Now, in some cases, the provider can immediately agree to the timeline expectation during the discussions with the customer. In other, because they might have had previous experience with other customers or users, but in case a new request come in, they may have to test it before they can really commit timeline to the customer and before they sign off on the SLA as part of the contract. So we have a simple request for information, complex onboarding of a new employee requiring contributions from many teams and systems. In some cases, onboarding a new employee could also be a simple request. So let me take you to the supporting material to give you a little more information how that works. So simple workflows, let's say a caller or a user asks for an application's user manual. So these steps would be predefined by the provider. For example, collect the email ID of the user and send that manual to them. And also a good thing would be to educate the user to use the self-help page and for this and other similar queries. And while the queries from the user should be very welcome, we don't want to sound negative to the user that, hey, don't come to us. But educating them about the self-help might help the user in the future because they need not call a number and they can themselves get an answer to the query if that is set up properly on the help portal. And then definitely welcoming them to call the service desk anytime to process the service request. And the other thing is the caller or the user is asking for a specific software. They are eligible for it. And so obtain the user details, check their eligibility if they're eligible for that software license. And it's possible that a manager approval may be required as per the current process before the software is provided to them. And once the approval comes in, then arrange for the software installation with the help of tech support. Now, the approvals should be as minimum as possible. Otherwise, users will get frustrated that, hey, I have to get everything approved. They're not giving me anything without any approval. It should be minimized, but where needed, as per policies, the approvals should be asked for. Now, complex workflows, even though on the other slide we showed single employee onboarding as a complex one, a better case would be multi-employee onboarding because, and the other example would be procuring various different components for a requester and only some of which are in stock. For example, a certain environmental infrastructure. So these are some examples of simple versus complex request. So we are back to the main courseware slide, and we were at the end of this.